this is a little snapshot of the report, which this webinar is based on. So the report is called Permission to Pollute, and it exposes how major polluters from big tech, the fossil fuel industry, mining lobbies, and others have lobbied to change rules around permitting. So that means they'll get permits for energy and industrial infrastructure granted more easily, with less community consultation, less environmental safeguards, and less democratic scrutiny. And they've also lobbied for public subsidies for their polluting infrastructure projects. So as a result, Europe risks not only living with more pollution, but paying polluters to create it. And this situation also makes it harder for communities impacted by polluting projects to resist. We'll go into more detail on how this happened, the corporate influence involved, and the deregulation wave it is part of. We'll also explain what it means, including for communities on the ground. So as part of that, we'll be hearing about 3 case studies. One from Bram, our big tech campaigner, who will talk about the powerful companies impacting communities living by data centers in Ireland. One is via video from Pascoe, who will talk about a rare earths metals mine in Sweden that would destroy the indigenous Sami way of life. And finally, Rachel will talk about the planned build out of pipelines carrying high pressure CO2, despite all the risks and dangers illustrated by accidents elsewhere, for example, in the States. And we will also end with some thoughts on how to resist. And once we've done that, as I said, we will go to Q&A. So do remember to post your questions in the chat. But now I'm going to hand over to Rachel.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So yeah, as Kat said, I'm Rachel. I will be presenting the main content, and I'm going to get started by sharing my screen. So hopefully you can all see a slide that says, how are EU laws made? That's because I want to go back a little bit before we get into the lobbying, particularly around permitting, because EU lawmaking is complex and it's subject to a huge amount of lobbying and often not a lot of scrutiny from the wider public. So with that in mind, this is a little refresher of how it works. New laws are proposed by the European Commission. The European Parliament, which is your elected MEPs, can propose amendments to those laws, as can the Council of the European Union, which is made up of the member state government representatives. They have to agree a common position, and the three institutions will then negotiate to agree a final law in a process called trialogues, which are generally very untransparent. Now, lobbying happens throughout all 3 stages. Including at the national level to influence member state governments' positions. But crucially, influencing the European Commission at the beginning, or even before things are proposed, it helps to set the agenda and shape what new proposals actually come out to begin with. So we talk a lot about corporate capture. And by that, we mean when corporations dominate decision-making and are able to influence outcomes significantly to suit their interests. And corporate lobbies are dominating more than ever before. So the biggest spenders on EU lobbying, which is companies and industry associations that declare an annual lobby budget of at least 1 million euros. Together, they spend at least 381 million euros a year lobbying the EU institutions. And that is nearly 50% more than in 2020. And in the top 3 sectors, we have big tech and energy. If you want to find a bit more about that, have a look at CEO's EU Corporate Lobby League table from this year. Now, corporate capture of EU decision-making leads to policies that worsen social injustice, economic inequality, climate change, and environmental destruction. CEO has been exposing the privileged access and undue influence of corporations and their lobby groups in the EU for nearly 3 decades. But in the last 2 years, things have gone into turbodrive with an unprecedented attack on rules that protect people and the environment at an unprecedented speed. A shift to the right and a business knows best attitude has seen the Commission embark on a major deregulation drive. The Commission is not just proposing new laws anymore, it's making sweeping proposals to tear apart bundles of existing laws that protect people and planet, but cost companies money. Those proposals are called omnibuses. Now, the European Commission's deregulation wave, in fact, means attacks on labour rights, climate policies, nature protection, public health, and more, all to please business. Not only this, but the Commission has set up new procedures and channels of influence to ensure that that deregulation wave continues. Crucially, whatever they call it, this deregulation drive is not about simplification. It is about ripping up rules that protect us, rules that were fought for decades by social, labour, and environmental movements at the request of big corporations and their political allies to increase those companies' profits. So, in May, we published a new report on a topic that I would say can be described as dry, permitting. But it's only dry on the surface. So what we discovered was that the EU is going full steam ahead to give industry permission to pollute at the request of some of its most polluting companies. How do we discover this? Well, we were digging into industry lobbying towards the European Commission in areas relating to climate, energy, industrial policy, and so on. And we did this by doing lots of access to documents requests or freedom of information requests. And when we were analysing the hundreds of documents that we got back, and I would say that required a lot of coffee, it quickly became clear that lots of companies in different sectors were asking for the same thing, for the EU to rip up its rules on permitting for their polluting projects. So in the last 2 years, since the start of Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's second term, permitting rules have been under attack, from big tech to big oil, from mining and metals lobbies to chemicals groups and big business clubs. The demands are to streamline, to fast track or accelerate permitting. Those demands have been pervasive. And to translate that lobby speak, we're talking about weakening permitting rules, putting in new loopholes and exemptions to them. So what? Well, permits are actually one of the most concrete ways that communities around Europe can be protected from the worst excesses of big business. EU permitting laws require companies to assess the impacts that their projects will have, be it a mine, a pipeline, a factory, or an airport, the impacts it will have on our drinking water, on wildlife, natural habitats, and the people living close by, and also to consult those people affected. So ripping apart these rules, or in EU speak, simplifying them, in practice means slashing the hard-won social and environmental protections that underpin permitting rules. Some of the key industry demands we're seeing being delivered in response to this lobby offensive include fast-tracked permitting for industrial and energy infrastructure. That means sidelining democratic participation of the communities affected, curtailing their rights. Simpler, quicker environmental assessments, which will mean less protection for water, soil, air, wildlife, and natural habitats. We're also seeing more dirty projects classed as strategic or public interest, and therefore getting special treatment in permitting processes, being elevated above environmental or social concerns. As a result of that, human health will be endangered by more deadly pollutants in water, soils, and air, as things like mines, pipelines, and factories get exemptions from these rules. And I want to point out that polluting projects like fossil gas and hydrogen made from it are increasingly piggybacking on exemptions that were designed for renewable energy by co-opting the strategic or public interest label. And to be clear, eroding social and environmental protections via laxer permitting is a concern no matter the type of development, be it gas pipeline or wind farm. But the way that dirty projects are increasingly being rebranded to get that laxer permitting shows the power of dirty industry lobbies. We're also seeing water protection laws and nature protection laws being opened up to be weakened further, which can bring further threats to biodiversity. So companies haven't just been pushing the Commission to fast track polluting projects. They've also been pushing for public subsidies to build them. And again, the Commission is saying yes, through new mechanisms like using public money to pay for private companies' risks, while guess what? Companies get to take the profits. Now that's called de-risking. And along with outright subsidies is a major way that the EU, at the request of dirty industry, is subverting the polluter pays principle. This principle, enshrined in EU law, requires polluters to bear the environmental and social costs of their actions. So what will be the result of this two-pronged attack to rip up permitting rules on the one hand and subsidize companies to build the polluting projects that they've made it easier to get permits for? Well, we won't just be living with more pollution, we'll be paying the polluters for the privilege. So this is quite a complex infographic, but basically the changes that are weakening permitting rules and riddling them with loopholes or providing polluters more public money to build projects, they're not all happening in one place. So this huge lobby offensive from industry to fast track, or speed up, accelerate, streamline, all these euphemisms to deregulate planning rules, they've been an almost universal demand across industries, trying to get more profitable projects off the ground. And that's influencing different laws. So it's about changing existing laws and through introducing new strategies and proposed laws, with more on the way. It's also, these changes are also happening with the application of statuses, as I've mentioned, strategic and public interest, to more polluting, problematic industrial projects, again, both through existing instruments and through new laws. So there are lots of policies that this concerns. There was the Resource EU strategy, the Grids package and Environment Omnibus that came out in December last year. We've had this spring the Industrial Accelerator Act, the Cloud and AI Development Act, and more. And many of these are actually still going through the legislative process. So the European Parliament and the Council of the EU are still providing amendments, forming their opinions, and getting ready to negotiate them. So therefore, these changes are not yet set in stone. Resistance is still possible and really important. A good illustration of this, a very influential fossil fuel lobby group that's called IOGP, the International Oil and Gas Producers Association, said of the Environment Omnibus, which contained proposals to deregulate multiple environmental laws. They said it showed real progress on long-standing asks from industry, including streamlined environmental assessments. That means we are seeing the profit-motivated demands of destructive industries that have a history of lobbying against the interest of people, environment, and climate being met. Meanwhile, environmental law group Planet Earth pointed out that the supposed 1 billion a year cost savings that the EU Commission said the Environment Omnibus would bring only concerned costs for businesses. It completely fails to take into account the 180 billion a year costs of not complying with EU environmental law, costs that are borne by citizens and society, from cleanup to healthcare. So when we talk about what's at stake for communities on the ground, communities resisting polluting and badly planned infrastructure around Europe, if all these changes to EU permitting rules do happen as industry wants, we're talking about communities having dirty and dangerous infrastructure imposed on them, as rights are curtailed by new loopholes and shorter timeframes. We're talking about more biodiversity loss, thanks to weaker environmental impact assessments, which in turn increases threats of disease and risks to food chains. We're talking about human health being endangered as more deadly pollutants are in our environments because projects are getting exemptions because of being classed as strategic or public interest. And we're also talking about workers getting stuck in polluting and dangerous jobs for longer because a just transition is being delayed. There are other more specific impacts that we're going to come back to in some of the case studies in a few minutes. Now, these changes that weaken permitting rules and fill them with loopholes, they've come about through unprecedented levels of privileged access for corporations. Corporations and big business lobby groups, they're not fighting to be heard. They are being invited to give their lobbying wish lists directly to the Commission, which has opened its arms almost exclusively to industry. at the expense of trade unions, public health groups, indigenous communities, environmental organisations. And this attack on permitting is part of the broader deregulatory drive at European level that's happening at the request of industry. So, on top of existing channels of influence, like direct lobbying, corporate dominated advisory forums, and industrial alliances, this has been fed into through new channels of influence that have been set up by the EU Commission in the last 2 years and designed to put corporate interests first. These include industry oriented consultations known as reality checks and implementation dialogues. These latter two are, I keep using the word unprecedented, but it truly is an unprecedented ramp up of privileged access and undue influence for corporations over lawmaking, and one that is allowing polluters to shape these sweeping omnibus proposals that tear up multiple laws at once to remove safeguards for health and habitats. So the Environment Omnibus that I've mentioned, that included a proposal to speed up environmental assessments, including restricting access to justice. Meanwhile, a group of fossil fuel and mining lobbies have teamed up to push hard for a specific permitting omnibus. If you want to find out more about reality checks and implementation dialogues in particular, which typically involve 80 to 100% corporate interests, have a look at CEO's recent report. This is what corporate capture looks like. Now, as important as these new channels of influence are, the huge and disproportionate influence of corporations and their lobby groups in the direct lobbying of the EU institutions is still really important. Just on the subject of permitting, in the year and a quarter that led up to March this year, the very highest levels of the European Commission met 6 times more often with business and industry than with environmental groups. The sector that was most represented in those meetings was the fossil fuel industry, including ExxonMobil, Shell, Equinor, and oil and gas group IOGP. So for a minute, sticking with the outsized influence of the fossil fuel industry over the EU's steps to rip up permitting rules for energy and industrial infrastructure, here's a couple more highlights, or rather lowlights. Just 2 weeks ago, at the end of June, the European Commission held an implementation dialogue on carbon capture and storage. Now, we'll talk a bit more about what that is in our CO2 pipeline case study. But this implementation dialogue was populated almost entirely by fossil fuel and fossil fuel using heavy industries. And in that dialogue, they highlighted the need to streamline permitting procedures. That followed the Commission actually co-organising a workshop on permitting with the oil and gas lobby group IOGP to discuss the need for streamlined processes and accelerated approvals. Again, permitting deregulation. And it also builds on a long-running fossil fuel-dominated advisory forum that was set up by the Commission, whose policy recommendations it follows closely. We'll come back to the ICM forum a bit later. And it's not just the oil and gas industry, by no means. Mining lobby groups, big tech companies, chemicals lobbies, big business associations have all been using the same sort of privileged access to push the EU into destroying permitting rules that help safeguard health and environment. Another example, when preparing its Industrial Accelerator Act, which includes sweeping exemptions to permitting processes in special geographic acceleration areas and for sectors that are labelled as strategic, which includes many polluting ones, the Commission held a reality check to prepare this act, and it was exclusively with energy-intensive industries. That means chemicals, steel, cement, ceramics. Fossil fuel giants were present too, as was mining company LCAB, which has been accused of destroying indigenous ways of life in Sweden, as you'll shortly learn more about. These companies use the opportunity to push again for simplified and fast-tracked permitting, which is exactly what they got. Now, the impacts that all of this is having and will continue to have if things progress the way that dirty industry lobbies want are illustrated by 3 case studies that we covered in our Permission to Pollute report. Data centre build-out, guzzling dirty energy in Ireland. Rare earth metal mines violating indigenous rights in Sweden. And dangerous CO2 pipelines headed to Europe as part of the fossil fuel industry's ploy to continue business as usual. First up, my colleague and big tech campaigner Bram to talk about data centers. So over to you, Bram.
Thanks, Rachel. Let me quickly share my screen. Okay. I'll start with an anecdote which I think is emblematic for the data center build out. So in February of this year, the UN rapporteur on human rights to a healthy environment was visiting Ireland, and she was visiting, she was meeting with academics, with businesses, with civil society organizations. She was also doing site visits, and at a certain moment, she wanted to visit Grange Castle, which is a data center cluster just outside of Dublin. It's huge. It's 200 hectares. It's one of the first data center clusters in Ireland. And when she asked permission to visit the site, she was refused access by Microsoft. Instead, she visited a local community in the neighborhood, which was struggling with electricity prices. So this shows how big tech has really been allergic to any external scrutiny of the environmental and social cost of the data center build out. While at the same time, there is fortunately also local resistance, grassroots organizing, which is taking on this huge industry. So let's quickly zoom in on Ireland, because it is a bit the canary in the coal mine of the data center industry. It was one of the first countries where there was an emerging data center industry, and also one of the countries which which is the first one to experience the quite dramatic impacts of this industry. So right now, like 2025, I mean, so last year, the latest numbers, 23% of electricity demand in Ireland is going to data centers, and that's a 10% increase in just a year. And Dublin, the numbers are even more staggering. 50% of electricity consumption is going to 120 data centers that are dotted inside and at the outskirts of Dublin. Electricity prices in Ireland are the second highest in Europe. And a recent study showed that between 2021 and 2023, an average household paid 263 euros because of the data center build out in Ireland. And that was at the time of rising electricity costs and problems with the cost of living. At the same time, we see that the electricity demand by the data center industry in Ireland is putting a lot of pressure on other priorities. So other businesses have troubles connecting to the electricity grid, and housing struggles as well. So, for example, the Grange Castle data center cluster, in the vicinity of that cluster, the Irish government built a power station that initially was aimed to power housing, but eventually the electricity, the power of that generator was all consumed by Grange Castle data center, the data center cluster in Grange Castle. At the same time, we see that as data centers are struggling as well to find connection to the electricity grid, they're increasingly relying on fossil fuels. And often that happens through on-site power generators, increasingly making them dependent on gas and other fossil fuels, and derailing Ireland's climate targets. At the same time, fortunately, we see increasing resistance from civil society organizations in Ireland, like Friends of the Earth Ireland, but also grassroots organizing, often appealing the permits that have been granted to these data centers. And that, of course, brings us back to Brussels, to the EU. So together with that increase in local opposition and resistance, Microsoft and other companies have turned their attention to the EU. For example, Microsoft called the environmental omnibus that Rachel already mentioned a strategic priority for its lobbying efforts. And they are finding quite a red carpet treatment in Brussels. So the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, herself has made winning the global AI race a key priority. And that means that the European Commission wants to triple data center capacity in the next 5 to 7 years. And how do they want to do that? They have recently published a proposal, the Cloud and AI Development Act, which basically streamlines permitting through so-called data center acceleration zones that each member state would be forced to establish, where basically no permits or very few permits would be needed. At the same time, the Commission would get the power to designate certain data centers as strategic projects, making them more easily eligible for public funding. Most of the meetings on the Cloud and AI Development Act, more than 80%, were with industry. And we have also seen quite fierce lobbying from big tech companies. For example, Google demanded from the Commission that only people living within 50 meters of a data center project would be able to appeal a permit. So that's a really far-reaching demand, which would drastically limit the power of people to protest against these data centers, to appeal them, and also shows how emboldened the industry is to make demands like these. At the same time, we see that sustainability plans or proposals by the Commission are being weakened or postponed. A couple of months ago, CEO revealed that the Commission copy-pasted a Microsoft amendment, basically making it practically impossible to get any environmental information of individual data centers on, to get any environmental information on data centers. And at the same time, minimum performance standards are being postponed. That would oblige data centers to meet a certain energy efficiency. But to end with a bit of a positive note, big tech is in a bind. They're pouring billions and billions of dollars into this AI bubble, which for the moment is still not profitable. And at the same time, these data centers are becoming hugely unpopular. So both in the United States, there is a huge protest movement that has already been able to block more than $150 billion in projects, data center projects. And also in Europe, there is increasing resistance against the data center build out. And that, of course, also explains why, for example, for a company like Microsoft, the environmental omnibus is such a strategic priority. They want to remove any roadblocks to the data center build out before the opposition can become too strong. But that also gives us an opportunity to stop this build out before it happens elsewhere in Europe. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you, Bram. Now there'll be a question to ask Bram, questions about that case study at the end. So do have a think, and you can pop them in the chat at any time. So next we have a presentation on mining from my colleague in the climate justice team, Pascoe. Unfortunately, he's not here in person today, but he recorded a presentation for us at the height of the heat wave. So here it is. I will pass over to the video now.
Hi, how you doing? My name is Pascoe Sabido. I am a colleague of Rachel Tansey's and Bram's. I am unfortunately not able to make the webinar in person, so I've pre-recorded a little input for the case study. I was part of the Permission to Pollute report alongside Rachel and was leading on the case study on a new rare earth metals mine in the north of Sweden. So I'm going to bring up maybe a little image. Here we are. So yeah, I'm going to talk about a new mine called the proposed mine called Pascoe in the north of Sweden, just by a town called Kiruna or Kiruna in the Sami name for it. But this new mine, which is being fast tracked by the EU, it threatens to destroy the life of indigenous communities there. So maybe a bit of background. The mine itself is owned by a state-owned Swedish company called LKAB, and it's an iron ore and rare earth metals mine. It's one of 47 projects that is being given a label, a strategic project under the Critical Raw Materials Act or CRM Act. And it's intended, along with these other 46 projects, to give the EU access to critical raw materials like rare earth metals, rather than depending on China. So the mining and the processing. So this is really how the EU becomes more competitive vis-a-vis China. But there's huge problems of what happens around these mines, who pays for them, who suffers from them, and what are the metals for. So this mine in particular, Pascoe, is actually a few kilometers away from an existing mine, Kiruna mine, LKAB's existing mine, which has already been threatening the lives of the indigenous communities there, the sort of Gabana reindeer herding community. So this is the reindeer migration that the Gabana reindeer herders are part of twice a year, seasonal migration from the mountains down to the sea, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of reindeer to go for summer pastures, to be able to eat and get fat, eat and then go back to the mountains. And it's a traditional way of life. And in fact, these reindeer are really important in combating climate change and packing down snow. And being part of millennia old tradition of cycles of nature. And the reindeer are really important for the local community in terms of like the Gabana community. So the chair of the Gabana community, who we're in touch with via a great ally of ours who's been working with the Gabana community for many years and put us in touch. The chair, Lars Marcus Kuminen, explained that everything is, I'm going to read it now, everything is founded around the reindeers. The food, the language, the knowledge of mountains, everything is founded around reindeer herding. If that ceases to exist, the Sami culture will also cease to exist. So it's really important to be sort of aware of that. So the reindeer herding is a critical way of life and is actually protected. Sami culture is protected by the UN and the Council of Europe, and yet has been threatened because the existing mine has already cut off almost all but one migration route for the reindeer, and this new mine, Pascoe, is going to cut that off completely. But the LKAB is instead focusing on the amount of critical raw materials, the amount of rare earth metals it's going to get. But in the CRM, sort of in the application process to become a strategic project, if your project impacts indigenous peoples, you have to have a credible plan for consultation and compensation. And in fact, the community, the Gabana community, have pulled out of the sort of consultation. They've been involved in it for decades. And the reason they pulled out is because it was window dressing. It was literally not giving them a voice. Instead, it was being able to be a tick box exercise for the mining company to say, look, we're talking to the local community whilst they continued to impinge upon their rights. So they've now pulled out of this process, which should stop the mining process, but it's not. It hasn't. So this is quite shocking that both the EU and LCAB are continuing to act as if nothing has changed, which is very worrying. But it's not just the local community, the local Gabonese community, it's also residents of Kiruna. As the existing mine expands, and Paraguay is basically an expansion of the existing mine, they're destroying the whole town and everyone's being forced to leave. And local residents are also being forced to leave and they're not being compensated. So we spoke to Pa Olablind, who we were put in touch with, who's a high school teacher in Kuduna, or Girona, as it's known by the Sami people. He and his fellow tenants in this apartment building don't want to leave because they're not being given sufficient compensation, and LCAB is refusing to negotiate to give them more. So people are really turning, people are having their towns destroyed, they're not being compensated. So there's a potential alliance between the Sami people and those of Kiruna. But LCAB has had I'd say outsized influence over the whole process, both the CRM process as well as at the Swedish level. LCAB had, its lobby groups had 6 meetings with high-level commission officials, so commissioners and their cabinets and directors general, in the 3 months before Paraguay was granted strategic status. So 6 meetings in those 3 months prior. So they've had an outsized influence. And LCAB in Sweden has had an outsized influence as well. Partly it's a state-owned company, but also due to the government in Sweden being very pro-mining at the moment. And it's really pushed, LCAB has pushed a deregulation agenda. Can they deregulate? And that, unfortunately, they've also succeeded in uploading to the EU level. The CEO, or the now departed CEO, newly departed CEO, who left, I think, at the end of April, Jan Molström, he is also the president of Euromines, and Euromines is the Brussels-based lobbying group, mining lobbying group, which is really influential in Brussels. And they've been lobbying, thanks to Jan Molström and others, they've been lobbying for deregulation, particularly on permitting, environmental regulations and others. And so one of their key successes, key things they've done, along with the oil and gas industry, they set up the informal permitting coalition, which has been pushing for an omnibus for permitting and also to weaken permitting rules. And lo and behold, what happened in December? The EU decided to open up the Water Framework Directive, which is a key thing for mining, explicitly to encourage more mining. That was their reason given for opening them up, even though the old one, they haven't got any credible evidence showing that it impeded mining. But the commissioner in charge of water, who was it? You guessed it, the Swedish commissioner, Jessica Roswell, Swedish commissioner for the environment, who has had a huge number of meetings with the Swedish mining lobby. I think she had the highest number of corporate meetings out of all commissioners. But she herself even visited Paraguay, visited Mostodom, and spoke about permitting and the need to sort of fast track. So yeah, we really see how this has come together from the local level to the Swedish level to the EU level, to make sure these projects are fast tracked. There's a whole new wave about to be announced. There'll be a new set of approved strategic projects soon, but there's also opposition. So, and on the ground, we're seeing the Gabonese community taking LCAB to court, but also there's another CRM project in Portugal, a lithium mine called the Barroso mine, and their Client Earth and local environmental groups, community groups, are taking the EU to court around this, and they're challenging the very basis of strategic status, because that strategic status means these mines are being fast-tracked and don't have to follow normal procedure, don't have to sort of follow normal consultations. So yeah, if they manage to win, this could be a really, really big victory. I'm going to stop there. I think Rachel's able to answer questions. But yeah, really great that people are here and really excited to be continuing this conversation. And thanks again to those in Kiruna, in Girona, who have, yeah, it's been great to be in touch with and really privileged to be able to raise up their stories.
Brilliant. Thank you, Pascoe, from afar. So for the next case study, it's back to me. So I'm going to share my screen again. Here we are. So this is a case study about proposed pipelines to transport hazardous carbon dioxide across Europe from sites of pollution to places where it could theoretically be used or stored. It's the fossil fuel industry who's been pushing this idea in a pretense that we can continue to use fossil fuels rather than phase them out. The idea is that no, we don't have to stop using fossil fuels to avert climate catastrophe. We can just decarbonize them with this massive infrastructure-based technology. Now, EU permitting rules come in because CO2 pipelines will benefit from new loopholes that are being introduced at request of industry. So, for example, in the Industrial Accelerator Act and in permitting acceleration proposals that are part of the Environment Omnibus and potentially the grids package as well. And we see more on the way. So for Europe, these pipelines that carry CO2 are still a hypothetical. But the US already has over 8,000 kilometers of them. In the US, they transport compressed CO2 to oil fields where it's actually used by fossil fuel companies to help pump out harder to access oil. Now, pipeline ruptures in the US show the risks that Europe faces. When this extremely high pressure CO2 leaks, it expands into rapidly spreading, low to the ground clouds of CO2, which is a heavier than air gas that can cause asphyxiation. From shelter in place orders for those living nearby to mass hospitalizations, affected locals have complained of ongoing health impacts months later, from lung dysfunction to chronic fatigue and mental fogginess. To take just one example from the US, in Yazoo County in Mississippi, a CO2 pipeline leak in 2020 caused more than 45 people to be hospitalized and 200 evacuated. Deprived of oxygen, children passed out, vehicles stopped working, hampering emergency responders who found people lying on the ground, shaking and unable to breathe. The emergency director of Yazoo County described it as looking like a zombie apocalypse. Satasha, the rural village where this pipeline leak happened, has a population density of just 11 people per square kilometre. So imagine the risks of such pipelines in the EU, where the average population density is 10 times that. Yet, as part of its avoidance of tackling the root causes of climate change, and guided by fossil fuel industry advisors, the EU plans to build 19,000 kilometres of CO2 pipelines by 2050, costing up to 23 billion euros, much of which would be publicly funded. Now, Italy and Germany in particular have big plans for CO2 pipelines, and their political leaders have been getting behind the fossil fuel industry by demanding major cutbacks to EU permitting laws. In Germany, civil society has warned that these pipelines would go through densely populated areas, endangering the lives and health of people and animals. And as this graphic shows, Germany and Italy both have around 20 times more people per kilometre than Yazoo County in the US. In Italy, the controversial Ravenna carbon capture and storage project, which is spearheaded by Italian oil corporation Eni and gas transporting company Snam, includes a 100-kilometre CO2 pipeline that would go through areas that are at high risk of earthquakes and flooding, as well as sites of high biodiversity and important habitats that are protected by European law, Natura 2000. Yet that nature protection has meant very little because the project's fossil fuel backers succeeded in getting this Callisto CO2 pipeline labelled an EU Project of Common Interest, or PCI. This means it benefits from fast-track permitting processes, access to EU public funds, and this label of being overriding public interest, which undercuts environmental assessments and allows them to be built on protected sites. And that kind of carve-out from environmental protection rules is increasingly going to be applied to big damaging energy infrastructure because big corporations are increasingly being invited to decide what counts as the public interest through new channels of influence, like implementation dialogues. The result of this is that infrastructure that is actually bad for the climate and dangerous to people, but good for corporate profits, gets special treatment. So future plans for CO2 pipelines are being fast-tracked in Europe by permitting loopholes, despite evidence from the US of just how risky they are. That is thanks to the outsized influence of big business lobby groups. So this European Commission has made it clear that listening to big business is its #1 priority. A hugely influential corporate lobby group called the European Round Table for Industry and another called Business Europe, which both have big oil members, helped set the permitting deregulation agenda. Their specific demands that have been met included acceleration areas. These are geographical areas where CO2 infrastructure projects, including CO2 pipelines, can be exempt from environmental impact assessments. And that is exactly what they got in the Industrial Accelerator Act. It's also due to skewed consultations. I think I've skipped a slide too soon, sorry. Now, in its preparation for an upcoming CO2 infrastructure and markets law, the Commission held a public consultation in 2 parts. Now, that consultation was heavily skewed towards industry, both in the way it asked questions and the way it interpreted the answers received. Briefly, even though 1/3 of respondents submitted strong objections and major concerns to the first part, which was supposed to shape the second part, they were ignored entirely. And the second part was oriented solely towards business interests, excluding environment, health, climate, safety, public finance risks and harms. That example of bias towards industry interests is now the subject of an ongoing complaint being led by German environmental group Bund to the EU Ombudswoman. It's also as a result of the EU inviting fossil fuel and polluting industries to shape its plans on carbon capture, transport and storage for years. I mentioned the ICM forum earlier as an example of corporate capture. That advisory body has been dominated and steered by fossil fuel industry lobbyists. Its working groups produce recommendations that the Commission closely follows. So it had a working group on infrastructure, co-chaired by none other than IOGP, the International Association of Oil and Gas Producers, which represents BP, ExxonMobil, Shell, Total Energies, Eni, Equinor, and so on. So last year, that group urged the EU to simplify and speed up approvals for CO2 infrastructure, including through a dedicated law. And that demand is being met later this year with a law that is expected to give CO2 pipelines the free rein that the oil industry wants them to have. So fossil fuel industry influence over EU policymaking is drumming up policy support, including through permitting deregulation, and lots of public money for a long-promised and never delivered technology. Carbon capture and storage has been failing for decades. Projects consistently underperform or don't happen. It's hugely expensive, risky, and energy intensive, and oil companies won't pay for it. They want taxpayers to do that. So this graph shows projections versus reality of carbon capture technology and solar. Carbon capture is clearly getting nowhere, while solar technology is outperforming all of its projections. Essentially, it's showing that carbon capture is a mirage, one that provides a dangerous excuse to keep polluting now. It not only serves to continue the harms and injustices of the oil and gas industry today, which already threatens the rights and environments of 2 billion people globally, it would add new risks and new dangers for those living near CO2 infrastructure, from earthquakes triggered when CO2 is injected underground to storage sites, to the potentially deadly effects when pipelines or ships carrying the CO2 there leak. And that wouldn't be a small number. Estimates have suggested that the carbon capture and storage industry, including infrastructure like CO2 pipelines, would need to be 2 to 4 times larger by 2050 than the current global oil industry. Phasing out fossil fuels is the only way to avert climate catastrophe. But to get there, we need fossil-free politics, a firewall between oil and gas lobbyists and the policymakers who should be acting in the public good, not the profit-making interests of big polluting corporations. So I realize there's been a lot to take in, 3 case studies on different topics that come with a lot of background. But the idea is that these case studies illustrate the risks of ripping apart permitting rules. And it's not just about mines or pipelines or data centers. Gutting EU permitting rules and the social and environmental protections that underpin them will affect many kinds of infrastructure. from ports, airports, and steel plants to wind farms, chemical factories, and roads. What's more, there is an ongoing and continued push to widen the scope of strategic to pretty much any industrial activity. And that would mean blanket loopholes and blanket removals of protections for local communities, drinking waters and soils, birds, and natural habitats. Increasingly, competitiveness is being used by the EU institutions as a justification to subordinate public priorities, protecting health, safeguarding workers, reducing biodiversity loss, and tackling climate change, subordinating those priorities to the interests of big business. At the same time, industry lobbyists opportunistically use this notion of competitiveness as a cover to delay, weaken, or derail planned regulations. But slashing regulations to save big companies money just shifts costs onto society, whether it's rebuilding after climate-related impacts, treating cancers and other pollution-related illnesses, or decontaminating soils and water. And there's an added irony here that environmental rules, it's been shown, are not actually what slows permitting processes down. So making an application process digital or properly resourcing the planning departments that process them, that would be good. Those are good things. But companies, what they actually want is often to tackle what they call bottlenecks that are actually protections for water, soil, and air, protections that keep humans and animals safe from toxic pollutants. So what's the alternative? Well, a just transition in Europe is both necessary and possible. Clearly, polluting resource extraction and industrial activities can't just be outsourced to the global south, nor are we suggesting that local communities and workers in Europe are against all new mining or industrial development. But such projects need to respect local communities, workers, and the environment. Ultimately, fighting for permitting rules is not about being against industrial activity. It's about how it's carried out, who it benefits, and who makes the decisions about the kind of Europe we want. There will always be trade-offs, but in answering who pays the price and who benefits, it should not be human rights and the environment versus executives and shareholders. So resistance to the EU's deregulation agenda is growing across Europe as people fight for the rules that protect our rights and environment. EU citizens are demanding that public health is not sacrificed to short-term profit-making and that the protection of nature is not traded for greater exposure to harm. And you can join hundreds of thousands of people who are calling on the EU to stop gutting environmental laws. Check out Hands Off Nature. Also, civil society groups ranging from trade unions, climate and environmental groups to those working on digital rights, corporate accountability, financial justice, and so on, have joined together in the Rules to Protect coalition to demand a fair and just society in which lawmakers protect and promote our rights and to push back against the EU's deregulation spree that cuts social, environmental, and human rights protections. But for such voices to have a chance of being heard, the privileged access to EU decision makers that's enjoyed by Europe's most polluting corporations must first be ended. Their narrow commercial interests do not represent the interests of workers, local communities, the environment, or the wider public. They're in conflict with them. Oil and gas, mining, chemicals, and big tech companies that have a direct financial interest in minimizing regulations should not be guiding the decision-making process, and they will not bring us to the future that we need. To get there, instead, we need fossil-free, toxic-free, and big tech-free politics, as growing movements are demanding. So for more information about any of this or to get involved, if you have particular questions, you can get in touch with us. All of these contact details will be shared after the webinar. And for now, I want to say a big thank you for listening and trying to take on so much information. You can follow CEO's work on social media, listen to our podcast, subscribe to our newsletter.